Uh, one of the bright spots of the way the last two election cycles have turned out is that I'm paraphrasing a World War II general who said, when you're surrounded, when they've got you surrounded, you can shoot in every direction. There is no one in this state who has known more about being able to shoot in every direction the last 6 years than our first speaker. Scott Walker was elected to the Assembly in 1993. He then ran in a special election, right, for Milwaukee County Executive in 2002 and won with 55% of the vote. He won re-election in 2004 and again in 2008 with 57 and 59% of the vote. Now this is Milwaukee County, which has its conservative areas, but has the city of Milwaukee, which is one of the biggest, strongest Democratic strongholds in the state. And Scott Walker has run every single time on an agenda of fiscal conservatism. He runs as a fiscal conservative, and he governs as a fiscal conservative, and he wins re-election big in one of the biggest Democratic strongholds in the state. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first speaker tonight, Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker.
Well, thanks. And I'm not a podium kind of guy. JB and I go a lot of these, and we know that. But I think in the interest of at least allowing the folks on Wisconsin I to be able to hear, I'll try and stay pretty close to this. It is an honor to be here with all of you tonight. Thank you, Lance, for that wonderful introduction. After an introduction like that, I should just probably say thank you very much. It's been good to be here, and good night. But I did have to think. I was telling folks at dinner at our table that besides coming here, usually the last couple of years has been just across the way. For Lincoln Day dinners, I come for other reasons besides just Republican events. And when you mentioned shooting, I'm glad that I have a good shot because I practice it every November when I deer hunt just down the way a little bit further, closer to the Mississippi in Crawford County over by Gays Mills, which is always fun. Although the last couple of years as I've come through here and definitely in Gays Mills as well, I've seen the remnants of the flooding and that, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we don't get a whole lot of heavy rain this spring, because I know it's been a challenge. I know when I came through last year, in fact, particularly right at this corner, when I do the end of June every year, I do a Harley tour around the state like former Governor Thompson used to do. And even at the end of June, I remember how bad it was, that even at 60 right over here, turning as we went up the way there and over towards Sauk City and saw that cemetery where you still barely could see the tops of the tombstones even a few weeks after the heavy rains. It was just phenomenal, the kind of impact it had on this community. So I'm hoping as I come back, it's nice to be here when there isn't too much water here, when things are a little bit calmer, and I hope, knock on wood, that'll continue through the spring. I also want to say greetings. It's interesting, you realize how you've been out of the legislature for a while, because when I used to serve with Cheryl Albers and with Gene Hahn, I'm glad to see great new replacements here, and at the same time some great favorites of mine. Dale Schultz and I served together for many years in the legislature. Just was talking with him a few weeks ago on our way to another event, and has given me some great insights. So Dale, I appreciate your leadership here, and really for that matter across the state. So thank you very much for your ongoing leadership. I was thinking today, JB and I and Randy and others were over at an event, actually a remarkable event, like a lot of Lincoln Day dinners or other conservative or Republican events. I see Mayor Ross here. You're going to hear from him in a little bit as well. And he was up with me in Superior a couple of weeks ago, and we had in Douglas County 120-some people at a Lincoln Day dinner there. We had 800-some people today in downtown Milwaukee, of all places, 800 conservatives in Milwaukee, if you can believe that or not. The guy right before me was kind of entertaining, because you probably have heard about him before. I'll just introduce him as his first name. It was Joe the plumber, he was a speaker right before me. And then Mark Block with Americans for Prosperity had a good line. He introduced me after that, and he said, we heard from Joe the plumber, now we're going to hear from Scott the tax cutter. So I said, I think I'll use that along the way, But something Joe said reminded me of something I've shared with others, but I'm going to share with you tonight just a quick story about what happened to me about a week after the election. I got invited to go to a couple of different trips, and one of these was to go down and speak to a group called GoPac. And what was interesting, there was a couple of us. There was JB's colleague from Virginia, the Attorney General, who's running for governor this year in 2009. There was another speaker right after him who's the Secretary of State from Michigan who's running for governor in 2010 there, along with a couple others, and then myself. And the woman who's the Secretary of State got up, and she kind of explained who she was, told what she was doing, a little bit about the future. And then, remember, this is a week after the election. She looked at this crowd and said, well, we kind of got beat up last week. Maybe it's time to broaden our tent and change our message. Absolute silence. So she sits down, I get back up, and I explain a little bit who I am, talk a little bit about what I've done, where I come from, 7 straight budgets without raising the property tax levy, the reforms we put in place, so on and so forth. And I get to the end, and I just can't let that comment she made go past because, that just really undermines why I was there. And so, because she was still seated there, I didn't call her out by name, but I said a lot of pundits since the last election, the last week or so, have said that maybe it's time we change our message and that something's wrong with that. And I told the people there at that time, just like I tell you here tonight, that I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with our message. I think the problem is, frankly, has been our messengers. Certainly at the national level, and probably, in fact, Joe the Plumber is a good example of that, because I think if you think back to last fall, particularly in September and October, as this nation was feeling the full impact of the economic crisis that faced us and this entire globe, Joe the Plumber probably did a better job of articulating a message for conservatives as to what we should be doing to get this economy going again. As much as John McCain is a great American and a wonderful war hero, I just don't know that he was the right messenger. And maybe in part it was because he didn't fully believe in the message. I look in contrast to someone that when I grew up, not in Wauwatosa where I live right now with my wife and our 2 wonderful kids, but I grew up not too far south and east of here in Walworth County, in Delavan, just down the way from where my friend Paul Ryan grew up. And for both of us, our inspiration in the 1980s to get into public service was a guy named Ronald Reagan. And I think back, almost literally 30 years ago, when in 1979, Jimmy Carter talked about this country being in a malaise because of the crises we were facing with the economy and global economy and things of that nature. And instead of just buying into that, Ronald Reagan stood up to the American people and said, you know what? This is America. We can do better here. And he had a clear message about talking and really looking at the future and saying we should limit the scope of government. We should lower the tax burden on our people and our employers, and we should return to a sense of personal responsibility. And he not only won with that, I would contend that because he won, all the way through the 1980s into the early 1990s, we saw the most unprecedented record of economic recovery this nation ever seen. We saw 20 million new jobs, 5 million new businesses were created between 1983 and the end of the decade. That's something that we should remind those in the media today who are talking about the crisis we face in this country and across this globe, that there is a way to react to that. There's a way to win. There's a way to get back. And it's not about spending more money, and it's not about taxes. It's doing but what President Reagan did in the 1980s. I look at that and say that was a message that was right because it was not just the messenger, and certainly he was a great messenger, but it was the right core message for the people of this country, and it brought us back to recovery. I look here in Wisconsin even more, and I think as much as we need it nationally, we need a great messenger here in Wisconsin too. We have a $5.7, as you guys know in the legislature, a $5.75 billion budget deficit. And how do we get there? It's the 4th largest in the country, the largest in state's history, and largely because of one man, Jim Doyle, whose failed leadership has year after year after year deferred that into the future to the point where when the economy fell apart, we had nowhere to go. Didn't just happen overnight. Jim Doyle likes to blame everybody else. For years it was Scott McCown. Then it was Republicans in the legislature. Now he's got nobody else to point to, and suddenly he's pointing at Washington again and trying to blame in the past something on the previous 8 years. Well, I think people realize is you can't go pointing the finger anymore. This guy had, as of last June, long before the financial meltdown of Wall Street, Jim Doyle was facing the largest gap deficit in state history, 3 times what it was in the year 2000, and the largest, if you measure it per capita, in the country. We face the deficit we have today because Jim Doyle failed to make the tough decisions in the past. And even worse, at a time when we're troubled just like anybody else in this country is for jobs, his answer is to plug that budget hole with $2.5 billion, not rating it as he has in the past from the transportation or the patient compensation fund, but instead now he's rating it from the bailout fund that supposedly was going to go to stimulate the economy. Instead, it's going to stimulate his budget deficit. On top of that, as if that wasn't enough, he's added almost $2.2 billion worth of new taxes in this budget. Taxes on wealth, taxes on employers, taxes on everything, even taxes that affect my teenage kids, like downloads on iPods and ringtones. Everything in between goes up. In fact, when I think about buying a new gun, if I want to buy it and I need a background check, my permit to do that, to do the 48-hour turnaround, is going to cost me 300 times more than it cost me before because of Jim Doyle in this budget. There's not a thing out there that doesn't cost more in this budget than it does because of Jim Doyle. That, for any of us looking at this economy and the crisis that we face from one end of the state, from one end of the country to the other, does anybody really think that raising taxes by more than $2 billion is the answer to get this economy going again? I don't think so. In fact, about 3 weeks ago, the day before Jim Doyle introduced his doom and gloom budget to the state, I had the honor of presenting what we called our blueprint for economic prosperity. Pretty simply, it was a matter of a series of economic development projects and a whole package of incentives, tax incentives, to get people working again. And probably the boldest one was one maybe you heard about, maybe you didn't. It was very simple. We said, let's take the lion's share of that so-called stimulus money that Wisconsin's eligible and really use it to stimulate the economy without creating a new budget hole for the future. And so what we proposed was creating a 10-month-long sales tax holiday in the state of Wisconsin. From this point forward to the end of 2009, we said, let's stop collecting the sales tax. Let's plug that money in. It's a one-time hit. It's a one-time benefit. It's not going to create a budget hole out there. But imagine the phenomenal impact. Think about the magnet for commerce we'd be here in the state of Wisconsin. Clearly, when it comes to retail shopping, whether it's on Main Street, malls, anything in between, it would have a big boom. But it would have a boom for others as well. For home builders who have been remarkably poorly hit by this economy. A typical home built here in the state of Wisconsin, the home builder building it would save almost $5,000 on that home in terms of sales tax they would otherwise have to pay for supplies and materials to build that home. A construction company that was taking around gravel or granite or other supplies out there that needs a new dump truck would save over $8,000 per vehicle in sales tax they would otherwise collect if we gave them that sales tax holiday. Imagine what really a magnet we would be across the state. Those are the sorts of things that we're trying to give as an alternative to say we believe in hope and opportunities for the future. We believe that we need to put money back in the hands of the people, not necessarily back in the hands of the government. That's the great contrast that's out there. The last thing I'll just leave you with before you hear from some of these other great speakers is some hope for the future. I'll give you two quick things. One, again, that week after the election when I went down to this other session, the day or two before that, I was honored to go to the Republican Governors Association. In fact, you may have heard about that, not because I went, but because the big speaker at that event was somebody you may have heard about. Her name was Sarah Palin. And that was the first speech she gave after the election. And that's what got all the attention, and certainly that was noteworthy because of what she had gone through. But what was totally glossed over, what was totally missed from that discussion, and I bet you most of you probably haven't even heard of today, is the fact that even though, Obama had these incredible numbers, despite the fact that he spent more than John Kerry and George W. Bush combined from 4 years earlier, and despite the fact that he dragged the rest of the ticket down, if you listen to the media, they would assume that nobody Republican won for anything, that it was all Democratic victories all over the place, and certainly there were more than I would care to be supportive of. But every Republican governor in the entire country who stood for re-election was re-elected last November. Every single one. But most of you didn't know that. And my argument would be that is because if you're even in the toughest of times that we saw with the phenomena of Obama, even in those times, governors who had been good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars and who were willing to be true reformers, like a guy we remember from about a decade ago named Tommy Thompson, if you're willing to do those things even under those tough times for Republicans, voters in those states put those people back in office. Even in states like Indiana, which went Democrat for the first time in 2 generations. Even in a state like Vermont, Vermont, a state that literally elects a socialist, not just a Democrat who acts like a socialist, but a socialist, re-elected Jim Douglas, a Republican governor in that state. That gives me hope for the future. The other part I know applies right here in Wisconsin, and that is, as I mentioned, I grew up near the state line in a small town called Delavan in Walworth County. And I can remember the last time the state of Wisconsin faced similar circumstances to what we face today. Early 1980s, national recession. Democrats were in charge of the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor was Tony Earl. Tony the Taxer, remember him? And we had a huge budget deficit, in large part based on poor decisions from the past, but also in part because of the recession that this country is facing, and certainly the state was not without its difficulties with that. What did we do to balance it, or what did they do to balance it? They didn't become more efficient. They didn't become more creative or innovative. What they did was turn to the taxpayers in the state, to the people and the employers who make this state work, and they said, we're going to tax you more to balance the budget. And remember what happened? I remember it well, because, again, I lived right on the state line, or near the state line. We had so many jobs and so many employers and so many people leaving this state. It got so bad that Governor Thompson, not Tommy, but Jim Thompson, the governor of Illinois, one of the few I might add who's not been indicted, but Jim Thompson, Big Jim, put up billboards. Any of you remember those billboards? The billboard said, when the last, you guys remember it down by Whitewater, when the last business leaves the state of Wisconsin, turn off the lights. It was that bad. It was that bad. And thankfully, a friend of ours from up the way in Elroy said very bluntly, you know what, this is Wisconsin. We can do better than that. And he looked the people of the state in the eyes and he said, we can do better, but we've got to have a different message and a different agenda. And he was the right messenger for that. He said, limit the size of the government, control the tax burden on the people out there, putting people back to work, and demand personal responsibility. And if we do that, we can get this state working again. Well, the good news to that story is he did just that. Tommy Thompson won election in 1986, and at least through the late 1980s into the 1990s, he did exactly that. He put this state back to work again. I'm here to tell you tonight that we shouldn't be down about the elections in the past, because that is the past. But less than a year and 8 months from now, we have an opportunity to do what we did in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and again with Tommy Thompson, and say to this people of this great state, we are a great state. Wisconsin is a great place to live, to work, to retire, to raise a family in. But we've got to get back to those same principles again. And we've got to find messengers not just in the race for governor, but to help our friends in the Assembly and the Senate, to help others who are trying to carry that message, the message that I believe all of you in this room here tonight never fell away from. The message that you've supported all along, and say, we need to find more messengers to put into office who say, this is a great state, but we've got to go back to those principles. We've got to carry that message. And when we do, not if we do, but when we do, not just as Republicans, but as people who love the great state of Wisconsin, I know we'll be victorious, not just on Election Day, but on the many days thereafter when we get the state working again. That's the kind of state I want to live in. That's the kind of state I want my children to grow up and live in. That's the kind of state I think we can have and will have with your help. Thank you very much for allowing me to share with you.
Yes. No, thank you, really.
All for lands.
We are expecting an important announcement from Scott sometime soon. Here's your chance. Got a camera.
Well, announce my campaign, and my campaign is to get the word out about this budget. And as long as we're doing that for the next 2 months, we'll see where that leads us after that. But clearly, this governor is not taking the state in the right direction. We've got to work first with Democrats and Republicans alike in the Assembly and the Senate to try and get that message out. That's our first campaign. And if that doesn't fully succeed, we'll see where the future takes us. And God willing, one way or another, we'll make a change. Thank you.